Exactly 7 weeks before Wisconsin's September 14th primary is a perfect day for a WisconsinEye Campaign 2010 interview with Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker, a Republican candidate for governor. Scott, thanks for coming in.
Good to be with you, sir.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
7 weeks from now, well, let me ask this. If the primary were today, would you win it?
Yes.
How big?
That I don't know. Doesn't matter. All you need is 50 plus 1.
Oh, okay, so you're confident.
Well, you don't take anything for granted. I mean, we don't take either the September or the November election for granted. But when I go around the state, the message we hear is a resounding positive one. It's when people are ready for the change. They're tired of the last 8 years of Jim Doyle. They certainly don't want a third term of Jim Doyle with Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett. And I think more often than not, they realize our campaign and my record represents the starkest contrast to the last 8 years that we've had. And we've done it. We haven't talked about it. We haven't just voted on it. We've done it. We've turned things around, and we can turn it around for the state.
Let's talk about the primary first. What are your biggest differences between you and Mark Newman? He's the best funded one in your rearview mirror. You may be leading, but he's posted a working balance of $2 million. So but differences.
Well, the biggest difference I think between him and I is probably a similar difference that I have with any candidate. That is, if the people watching right now, if we were all going to form together a new company, the CEO we'd pick would be someone who was running a similar company under similar circumstances and doing a good job. I would argue, Republican or Democrat, there's nobody else out there who inherited a situation more like what the next governor will going to face as to what I faced 8 years ago. And I did what you'd want. I cut our debt at the county level, reduced the size of the government workforce. Because of that, improved the county's bond rating, did 8 consecutive budgets without proposing a tax levy increase from the previous year. And last year, when the state had a record deficit, we actually had a surplus. All along the way, still providing for core services. Because of our investments, we have the fastest growing airport in America that we run, and added nearly 1,000 new private sector airline-related jobs. We got the gold medal for the best park system in the country. Last October, we eliminated the waiting list for long-term care services. I would say if I can take on the political machine and win in Milwaukee County, not just in terms of winning at the ballot box, but winning in how we govern, that to me makes me different than not only my primary opponents, but also the general election. I've done it, and I can do it successfully for Wisconsin.
Is it an issue on September 14th in the GOP primary that Mark, to some extent, is self-funded, having put $2.7 million of his own money into the campaign?
Well, I think putting millions of your own money certainly makes you credible. People say, do I discount our primary? Absolutely not. When you've got that kind of money, you've got a former congressman in the race who's got some name ID, certainly we don't discount that for 1 minute. But, having said that, I really, and I know when I talked about this at the press club not long ago, people were surprised I spent all my time talking about Wisconsin and turning the state around. And one of the panelists said, well, why are you overlooking the fact you had a primary? I said, no, I don't overlook it. I just have no reason to talk about my primary opponent. I mean, in the end, I want to talk about what I want to do for this state. And there's not large policy differences. The main difference is background. In our case, when you mention money, I mean, the good news for us, I guess that is the other big difference. We raised $2.5 million the first half of this year, more than anybody else out there. But the thing I'm the most proud of is 71% of that, essentially 3/4, came from people who gave me $50 or less.
Let's talk about money. You did raise $2.5 and $2.9 million in 2009, total of 5.4. Your balance on July 1 was, as you said, $2.5 million. What are you prepared to spend all the way through November 2nd?
What it takes to win and what the people of the state are willing to help us out with. Again, the overwhelming majority, 3/4 essentially of our funds are coming from people giving us $25, $50, $75 at a time. They're going to be the ones who dictate how much we raise in the future. And I think, we saw it the last half of 2009. We see it again in 2010. That enthusiasm is still out there. All 72 counties, tens of thousands of donors, more money and more donors than even Tommy Thompson had in the past. And I think that's a sign that we have a movement. Maybe you'd call it a brown bag movement jokingly, but the bottom line is a movement of grassroots activists who want to take the state back. 2
more quick questions about Mark Newman. When he says he's an outsider and he should be the next governor, because he is an outsider, how do you react?
Well, I think if you look at people who are upset, and that's a lot of people, not just the Tea Party movement, but are upset with government, be it at the federal, state, or local level, and people say, well, how do you reach out to those voters? I say, I tell them my record. I mean, we had the original Tea Parties 8 years ago. They were called recalls. I was part of the first one, and there were 7 other supervisors who recalled in Milwaukee County. The reason I got elected and then reelected twice thereafter in a county that's never elected a Republican before, in a county that had a lot of people frustrated and upset with the government, just like people are today, was that we came with a bold agenda, and then we did it. I can't tell you how many times I hear voters say to me, you know, I haven't voted Republican before, or I'm all over the map, but I'll vote for you because you told me what you're going to do and you did it. I think people want results. They want leadership more than anything. And that to me, you can be an outsider. You can be someone who's consistently challenged the status quo, even if you currently hold office.
WisconsinEye covered a town hall meeting that Mark Newman held, and he was asked about some of the campaign charges he's used against you, and he said, I raised these issues so, well, in essence, he said, I raised the issues because the Democratic candidate would, had I not done so. Your reaction?
Well, they already are. One Wisconsin now, all the liberal groups are raising these issues that just aren't factual. He's repeating them. It's kind of odd to have a Republican, no matter who it is, using as their basis a liberal interest group as the basis for that. But we pointed out months and months ago how they were wrong. You know, we have, even with my year after year after year proposing budgets that did not raise the property tax levy from the previous year, in many years the county board adding more in, I veto it back down to zero, they add some over a veto override over my vetoes of those. The bottom line, even with those county board additions, the level of county government operating budgets is less than the rate of inflation. So the numbers he talks about comparing it to Jim Doyle, where he adds in everything else the county does without in any way accounting for a similar comparison with the state, is not an apples-to-apples comparison. The bottom line is we've controlled spending by reducing the size of the government workforce, by holding the line on government benefits, and it's just an erroneous comparison.
New subject, I promise. The Republican Governors Association ads say Tom Barrett, like Jim Doyle, quote, only worse, close quote. Is that a fair charge?
If I were to ask the voters of this state, do you think the last 8 years are better than they were 8 years ago? I don't think anybody in this state would tell you yes. Clearly the national and global economies had an impact on that, but I would argue Jim Doyle's failed policies have made it worse. There's not a major policy issue out there that Jim Doyle isn't the same or excuse me, that Tom Barrett isn't the same or worse than Jim Doyle. On taxes, on spending, for all the talk of putting government on a diet, I mean, Tom Barrett, as a member of the state legislature, voted for the largest tax increase ever. As a member of Congress, voted for the largest tax increase in U.S. history at that time. And every year he's been mayor of Milwaukee, up until now, he's proposed a tax levy and fee increase budget. Now he's suddenly talking about a diet. That's exactly the kind of talk we got out of Jim Doyle. On that issue, on the global warming task force legislation, on health care mandates, on issue, and even things as simple as voter ID and other issues down the line, Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett have exactly the same position. So I think it is fair.
But he questioned, just to prolong this a little bit, Tom Barrett questioned elements of the climate change bill.
Not the components that would have cost jobs. He talked about concern about the process, but the fundamental mandates that were the source of the independent reviews that said it would have cost us 43,000 jobs in the state, those are the things that not only did he not question, but he told a WisPolitics luncheon back at the end of last year that he was frustrated that that wasn't going to be passed this session, and that if governor, he would make that a priority. So he's actually even been further out in being aggressive than even Jim Doyle was this last
He also said he had questions about the early release program.
Well,
so did you.
But that's a prime example. I've said, there's the key difference. You got to watch the semantics. A year ago, when the chips were down, when Governor Doyle was pushing early release, I stood with police officers, with the police association, with sheriffs, with DAs. I contacted every DA and sheriff in the state, Democrat and Republican alike, bipartisan effort, and said, we cannot afford to have convicted felons let out early. I led the fight to try and do that. Unfortunately, the governor was successful in getting that enacted. A year later, when Tom Barrett didn't say a thing back at that time, he stood completely silent. A year later, now that the public doesn't like this policy and many DAs and sheriffs across the state are concerned about it, now he says he's got concerns. That's very different. I have said flat out as governor, I will put back truth in sentencing. I will stop early release. As governor, there will be no convicted felons who get out early on their sentence and confinement in the state prison. Tom Barrett's only said he's concerned. That doesn't mean he's going to stop the policy of letting felons out early. That to me is the same thing. If you're not willing to say, I'm going to stop it, then that's the same as being complacent and allowing it to happen.
Questions are being raised about your the maintenance of county buildings as a result of these accidents. Your One Wisconsin Now is just today is pointing to your veto of a engineering position that the inference is that maybe it could have inspected buildings and prevented one of these accidents. Yeah. Can you bring us up to date on what you've learned about county maintenance? Anything you wish you'd done differently over your tenure as county executive in terms of maintenance of buildings?
Yeah, the bottom line is it's yet another example, and tried to take advantage of a tragedy like that, a personal tragedy for political purposes, is just really outrageous. And this is another example. This had nothing to do with any of the issues that have been raised of late. This was an add-on position that was already funded within the Parks and Architectural and Engineering Division. This would not have had any impact. In fact, what we've found thus far, and we're waiting to see what the actual cause was of that tragedy back in June of this past, obviously this past month with O'Donnell Park, is really honing in on how that building was put together back in 1991 and before that when it was being constructed, and whether or not the contractors actually followed the plans. That obviously is a major concern. That's something that no inspection or review would have found, because no one in their right mind, if the building wasn't installed the way it was supposed to be, would know. The only way we're finding out clues about it right now is literally to go in with sonar and do testing because of what we found on the panel that failed and came off there. But that's something that no level of inspections would have been able to find. And in fact, all of the maintenance issues that were identified on the inspections over the last several years that were done on O'Donnell Park actually found that all that work has been done. And it was done well in advance of June 24th when that tragedy occurred. So what we're finding is exactly what we expected. We've gone from structure to structure, doing a very comprehensive review and a very thorough review, is that the issues that have been addressed in the past, the things that we brought up, the work has been done. We're moving forward in that. We continue to look at not only the facades and the exterior, but looking at maintaining our buildings on the inside. But we, over the last 8 years, have poured in our budgets and what we've spent, what we budgeted through this year, $730 million on maintenance, on renovations, on repairs. I don't think anyone objectively would look at that and say that doesn't really considered to be a very significant investment in the infrastructure of our county buildings. And for all these others trying to make insinuations of a very tragic situation, I just think it's despicable.
Okay, it's been a few weeks since WisconsinEye's had a chance to interview you, so a few issues have emerged since then. So let's go back. Since then, you have said, I want to correct me if I'm wrong, state employees should pay their full share of their pensions apart, and starting when? And how would you get that passed?
Yeah. What I've said, and I'll propose this in my first budget, is right now, other than a handful, there is a small group of state employees that make some contribution to the employee contribution to the pension system. But other than that, all state workers, the employee and the employee contribution, are both paid for by the state.
Right.
Most people outside of state government, the employee pays the employee contribution, the employer pays the employer contribution. What I'm asking for us is for us to parallel what the overwhelming majority of people do in the private sector. It's not in any way going to take away from the pension. It's not adding anything that's unfair or undue compared to what others do, but it's saying for the part that is by name the employee contribution, every state worker should do that. And I'm so serious about it, even though the budget won't be presented and passed until arguably later into June of next year, by the time it's ideally passed before the start of the next fiscal year on July 1, I will start on January 3rd. When I take the oath of office as the next governor, I will start making the governor's employee contribution to the pension system that day, in the same way that 8 years ago, when I first came as the county executive, we had pointed out that my predecessor made more money than the governor of the state of Wisconsin. I thought that was wrong. And since then, Tonette and I have given back $370,000 of our personal salary to the taxpayers. I'll make that same leadership move when it comes to the pension contribution.
Is your budget bill going to call for state employees to pay their full share of pensions in calendar 2011? Or do you need calendar 2012 to allow for it to be part of bargaining with state unions?
Well, we would work on that as part of trying to do it in the first fiscal year of our budget. The bottom line is we've done that here in Milwaukee County. From the standpoint of, we made in our last budget for 2010, last fall we passed it, $10.3 million worth of savings that came from wage and benefit reforms, reduced the multiplier in the pension system down to where the state employees are at. We made changes in health care in terms of a higher premium, a mere $30 more per month for a very low premium to begin with, and we froze salaries. Those changes, along with a few other smaller ones, saved us $10.3 million. And we got that through not only for our non-union employees, but already 3 of our major unions have stepped up and said, we'd rather do that than layoffs or furloughs, and to their credit, they're helping us balance the budget.
You've also said we're going to abolish 4,000 jobs, still on the books but vacant. You've heard the criticism, this doesn't save any money because the jobs are vacant. Quick response?
Yeah, there are 4,700, 700 are public safety. So I've said of those 4,000 remaining, they've been vacant for a year, but they're budgeted. As you know, covering the budget for years, the money is in the budget. In every state agency, there's money for all these positions out there. Because they're not filled, it makes it easier to eliminate them because you're not laying them off. But the money is still in each agency's budget. We're not saving it. It's still within those budgets. For the next biennial budget, I will permanently eliminate those positions and take that money out of each agency's budget, the equivalent of that dollar amount. So it will indeed save money.
So state employees contributing pensions, you score that at 180. Is that in the next biennium?
180 per year.
180 per year. Total
so
360.
360.
That assuming you get that through the unions and everything else. Well, we'll come back to that because the unions, that bargaining process is totally separate from your unrepresented.
You're exactly right. You can do it to non-represented employees, but the bottom line is we have a $2.7 billion budget deficit.
You're taking the Fiscal Bureau 2.5 plus the 200 for the patient's comp. Okay,
exactly right. You look at that and say, any governor, to balance it's going to have to do some important things, and I would argue the things I'm talking about with the pension contribution, with eliminating those 4,000 vacant positions.
How do you score that?
With that one's just under $900 million per biennium. So in total, you're over $1 billion. It's one of those where, in the end, not only do I want to balance this budget, I want to correct what Jim Doyle has failed to do through all the budgets up until now, and that is he's just deferred it. You know, it was raiding the patient compensation fund. It was raiding the transportation fund. It was deferring school aid payments. Now, this past budget, it was raiding the Obama bailout fund, taking $2.2 billion of one-time stimulus aid and not using it on roads or bridges or infrastructure, but plugging in to take care of the Medicaid and the school aid deficit. Those are all things that add to your structural deficit. I want to do things that change the base, which is why you address major reforms in wages and benefits, because they not only help you balance the budget, they help you balance future budgets.
One other thing that lowers your base, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, by forcing employees of some school districts and local governments into the state health care plan, you score that at $310 million over the biennium?
Yeah, it's about $68 million for school districts. The rest is for local governments. More than half would benefit. Others wouldn't lose, but you've got a number of school districts and local governments that, by the good fortunes, have negotiated plans that are at the same or lower than the state's plan. We wouldn't force them to go in the state's plan. But for all the rest, $68 million worth of savings in the school districts just by moving, not by changing the plan, but by moving their employees into the state employee health care plan. Tremendous savings. Okay.
Some of your fellow county officials across the state want a constitutional amendment. No more transfers from the transportation fund.
I agree.
Now, you back that?
Yeah. As governor, I flat out said I would, as governor, I won't raid the fund, and I like the idea. I would not only support what they're pushing at the county level, I would push a constitutional amendment. Obviously, it takes 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature and a vote of the people, but I would support that so that no future governor, like Jim Doyle, could raid that fund ever again.
The UW system recently asked for 2% pay raises that UW employees didn't get and cancel furloughs. How do you feel about that?
Well, long term, whether it's UW-Madison, La Crosse, Eau Claire, Green Bay, Whitewater, all these other campuses I visit, I like to give them greater flexibility and autonomy and control over individual campuses. I think if they can show, not just on tuition, but particularly on financial aid, they can keep pace with that. If they can show in the mix how that applies to their faculty and staff, I'd love to give them greater flexibility of that within certain guidelines, things that keep the average tuition at a reasonable level. I think you want to do that long term, not just short term, things that would show that more Wisconsin residents could get into our University of Wisconsin schools, things that would show greater financial assistance. I think all those would be beneficial. On the furloughs, I thought those were a huge mistake. That's a prime example of how really kind of placating to one particular special interest group. Jim Doyle, Governor Doyle, applied those furloughs across the board. In the case of much of the furloughs in the UW system, those were furloughed to positions funded by either federal or grant funding. Didn't save any GPR, no state funding there. To me, that's like cutting off your nose to spite yourself. We shouldn't be doing it. In the same way, we shouldn't have furloughed correctional officers or others who are 24/7 who don't provide any savings. I didn't do that at the county level. I didn't hurt revenue generating positions, and I didn't hurt public safety or public health positions, because that it might have been fair to everybody, but it didn't make any sense to do it.
In your first budget, are you going to ask, are you going to recommend no pay raises for state employees just because, as you said, the deficit is 2.5 or 2.7?
Well, I think that's certainly something we've got to look at. I mean, I look at employers all across the state, and the bottom line is most people right now are happy to have a job, and they're willing to take a pay freeze. In some cases, or some businesses, they're taking a pay cut just to keep people working at those firms. I don't know how we ask everybody else to do that and then go out and approve big pay increases.
Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance recently reported net property taxes statewide $9.4 billion with a B, up 4.9% to the point where they took 4.5% of personal income. Mm-hmm. What are you going to recommend to cut or control property taxes?
I think you have to cap
the elephant in the room for decades.
Well, I think you have to cap off property taxes. It's things like my friend Mitch Daniels has worked on in Indiana, I think very successfully. We have to cap off property taxes, I mean, to truly freeze them. But the way you do that, a mistake I think even some Republicans made in the past, is they just focused on the freeze and they didn't focus on how to protect core services at the local level. To me, how you do that is you give local governments wage and benefit controls. You allow them to ease up, particularly if you set aside the fire and police. Just look at all other employees. Give them controls over arbitration so they can actually take the dollars they spend and make sure that even with a cap on property taxes, the dollars are spent on services and not on escalating benefit and compensation packages. You stop unfunded or underfunded mandates out there, and you allow things like I propose, like local governments and school districts to buy into the state health plan. All those are things that would allow them to get by and still provide good services even without raising property taxes.
Well, do you think it's realistic to think you can cap the net property tax total at $9.4 billion? With some of those changes?
I think if not an outright cap, at least if you can keep it within inflation, I think that's
CPI?
I think that's a reasonable expectation. I think in the end, if cost of living adjustments in Social Security and pensions and other benefits aren't exceeding that level, why we should be allowing the government to grow faster than that, I think just pushes the burden on to the people least able to pay, people on fixed incomes who are retired, or in many cases, young families just starting out, where they're at workplaces where right now, just to keep their job, they're not getting any pay increase.
The Doyle administration just announced the actual startup of Badger Care Plus Basic, pointing to a waiting list of 50,000 people waiting for state-provided health care. Would you stop this program as governor?
Well, a couple different things. On Badger Care and Wisconsin Shares as well, both of those were supposed to be temporary safety nets as people came off of welfare and went into the workplace. Under Jim Doyle, those time limits have been removed. I think in many cases they become a permanent entitlement, and I think that's not only not good for the state government, it's even worse for the people who are getting those entitlements, because it keeps them into a permanent cycle of dependency on government assistance. That's right. It's what we tried to break in the 1990s. People have said, would you like to move people off the Medicaid rolls? I said, absolutely. I think they asked that cynically, thinking that's a negative. I said, I want to move them off the Medicaid rolls, and I want to work them onto the rolls of the workers in this state. And that's why the things we're doing, the things we're teeing up, our goal of 250,000 private sector jobs through our 6-point plan to get the state working again, are just the sort of things that will open the door so more of those people can get into the workplace, being employed at places where health care is a part of their coverage and being employed.
If you want to reduce the number of state residents that get total or partial health care through the state, have you just said that you would end Badger Care Plus Basic?
Well, what I do is I reenact time limits. To me, I don't think it's not about ending Badger Care. It's about saying there should be reasonable time limits and an expectation that you're not going to spend your entire life in part of a permanent dependency on the government. There shouldn't be a lifetime entitlement. What we should be doing is phasing people off, particularly for those who are able-bodied citizens who can work. We should be opening the door in the private sector to making it easier to create jobs in the state, and then putting in place reasonable expectations that the people who are getting assistance right now can move into those jobs and not be permanently entitled to the state.
Tony Evers, Superintendent of Public Instruction. Since the last time we talked, let's use $897 million in tax credits to boost K-12 aid to public schools. Are you open to that? You want to discuss that?
You know, I'm willing to work with Superintendent Evers and anybody else who cares about kids and cares about taxpayers and wants to balance that out in the state. But as I look at that plan, it's just about rearranging the dollars. It doesn't fundamentally address the school aid formula. It doesn't address declining enrollment districts. It doesn't address the real challenges, which are not the dollar amount, because the question is not necessarily do we need to spend exceptionally more money on our education system, but do we need to better spend it? And I would argue the things we should be honed in on, this governor who claimed to be a pro-education governor cut the school aid formula, but more importantly, more damagingly, pulled back on the QEO, which was the one cap that local school boards had to keep wages and benefits under control for school district employees. I think we need to reenact either an outright QEO or something very much like that to give them that control. I think we need to put a moratorium on all new mandates from the state on school districts and other local governments, and then start to peel back the ones that are already there. We need to open the door so that school districts who have higher cost health care plans can opt into the state plan. We need to do other things that make it more cost effective for school districts to really consolidate the services they provide, particularly in rural areas across the state. Not a mandated consolidation of the district, but consolidate services through the use of technology and other means to make the dollars we do send from the local property taxpayer and from the state government that are sent to each school district are better spent. That's our problem right now. It's not that we don't have enough money, it's that it's not spent correctly.
According to the Fiscal Bureau, state aid for K-12 schools is $6.23 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the budget that Governor Doyle signed, the one we're operating under now, reduced state aid slightly for public schools. Are you willing to recommend another cut in state aid to public schools because of the deficit that the next governor looks at?
My approach on that is we need to be honing in on taking the dollars we do have and making sure they can be spent more effectively. I'm not looking at this point at cutting, but saying the dollars that are out there need to be spent more effectively. I think we can help school district by school district all across the state, help the school district perform at or better than they are today if we do those reforms I just talked about, giving them back some control over wages and benefits, freeing them of the unfunded or underfunded mandates, allowing them to opt into lower cost health care plans, giving them the freedom and incentive to go out and use technology to consolidate services on a larger regional basis. Those are the things that need to be done with education.
The federal health care reform law mandates that states or regions set up exchanges. If the Doyle administration sets up a Wisconsin exchange by the time the next governor is sworn in, would you stop it?
Well, two different things. One, I'm going to aggressively pursue an agenda along with J.B. Van Hollen, our Attorney General, an agenda that would allow us to not just only challenge the federal health care mandate, but particularly to allow us at a minimum to opt out. Wisconsin has been a leader in getting reforms before and waivers so that we can enact education reform and welfare reform and other reforms. We can do health care reform better in Wisconsin than I think the government at the federal level can ever do here, and largely by not just relying on the government, but by freeing up more market-driven solutions to help us provide real solutions for families and small businesses in this state. Along with that, though, until that's resolved in the courts and at the federal level, and hopefully there's a number of new faces in Washington that put people like Paul Ryan on the forefront where he can repeal and repair that federal health care mandate. Along with that, we need to look at what they're doing in terms, and I think they are going out more aggressively than almost any state in the country, and they're doing it for political purposes and political purposes only. And certainly I'm seeking out open records to figure out exactly what they've already promised to the federal government in being one of the leaders from a negative standpoint in trying to enact these exchanges. And there's really no reason, from what I see and what I understand talking to people working on this issue, why if we're going to have an exchange, why we couldn't look more to streamline this more to like a Utah has done as opposed to what they're proposing here in Wisconsin, where you have a handful of employees in the government and all the rest of it's done in cooperation with the private sector, versus what they're talking about is a massive new government bureaucracy that won't add a penny towards true health care being provided, but instead will just add another thick layer of state government. I think that's exactly the wrong answer. And whether it's the federal or the state government, I don't want government mandating to my family or any other family across the state dictating to us what we have to do with health care.
I think you just said you would shut down any exchange that's set up by
well, certainly one by Doyle. If I'd prefer to have the option to do what we can do here in the state, but clearly we're not going to allow what he's proposing and what his political cronies are proposing to do to go forward. We're going to alter it in a way so that even if we have to have something, if our efforts to fight the federal legislation and mandate aren't successful, we at least have something that's more market-driven and isn't based on this huge government bureaucracy.
Tom Barrett, when he turned in his nomination signatures, said the process that draws new boundary lines for Congress and state Senate and state Assembly is broken. We need a new process. Do we?
You know, in the end, I had to chuckle. I mean, for a guy who's had one of the most partisan records in Congress to now talk about a bipartisan process is an interesting, election year extreme candidate makeover, I guess. But from the standpoint, I'm willing to look at options. I mean, that to me, frankly, other than a few editorial board writers, I don't hear anywhere. What I hear from people all across the state are people who tell me they're sick of a government that doesn't understand that government's not the solution to their economic woes. They're sick of people fighting over issues that they don't think in any way relate to saving their job or helping create more jobs in the state. And so I'm willing to look at any number of options, but to me that's not really something I haven't spent a lot of time thinking or talking about, because that's not on the top of our priority list.
Do you have a goal for a percentage fewer of state employees that there would be in 2018 at the end of a second Walker term?
I don't have a goal. What I can tell you about is, in my case, there's 20% fewer employees working at the county level than when I first took office, government employees working, and that's largely attributable to attrition. We reorganized positions and to contracting out. We contracted out for things like food service and janitorial services and some of our social services. We contract with community-based groups like Catholic Social Services or Lutheran Social Services or Goodwill Industries. Much of that work is done more efficiently with our partners in the community. If there's places to do it, we would do it at the state level as well.
Maybe the final question. We're 7 weeks away from the primary, and then 5 or 6 weeks beyond that for the general. What's the Scott Walker campaign going to be doing differently in the next 2 months?
I don't know about differently. We're just going to reinforce our message. I mean, to win it takes mom. Not just my mom, although she's very supportive, but MOM. A strong message. We talk about our brown bag guide to government. It's about don't spend more money than you have. Smaller government's better government. People create jobs, not the government. All leads into our plan to create 250,000 new jobs by getting government out of the way. Clear, the message is strong. It is resonating. We're picking up support all across the state, in every part of the state. The organization has been phenomenal. That's the O. In MOM, last weekend alone, we had a goal of 65,000 calls. We exceeded that. We did well over 70,000 volunteer calls and nearly 10,000 door-to-door contacts. A month ago, we had a goal of 26,000. We exceeded that by 42,000. We just had unbelievable support, the kind of support you normally see in a presidential campaign a week or two out. And fundraising, the M, the last M is money. Fundraising-wise, we've raised, as you mentioned before, more than anybody's raised before in this 6-month period. But the great news for me about it is 71% came from people who gave me $50 or less. What that tells me is every step of the way, the message is powerful. It's driving a strong organization. It's got a grassroots base of donors out there people are not only giving you money, $25, $50 at a time, but are putting up yard signs and contacting their neighbors at church and the grocery store and at school in the fall. That's what we need. We need to get our message out. We're doing it in different ways, not only door-to-door and phone calls and person-to-person. We're on the internet, we're on YouTube, we're on scottwalker.org and MyScottSpot, and all these new techniques as ways to reach out to people, and it's been very successful.
Scott Walker, thanks a lot.
Good to be with you, Steve.
We'll talk to you again very soon.
Great, thanks.
Our Campaign 2010 guest has been Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker, a Republican candidate for governor. Thank you.